Our sessions will begin shortly. Please make your way to your seats.
so many countries that make collective action on anything sometimes feel elusive. And amid all this, of course, oh yeah, there's climate change, right? While the impacts of extreme weather are being felt more and more around the world, environmentalists, climate experts, energy experts all tell us that so far our response is not strong enough to really stave off the worst consequences of a warming world. So what leaders choose to do or not to do in the next year, let alone the next 10, will really echo for generations. So let's get to it. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists for our opening session on leadership in an era of both peril and, I think, possibilities. Please join me in welcoming to the stage His Excellency Hashim Dojo Hakisumu, Indonesia's Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Energy, and Environment, Laurence Tubiana, a key architect of the Paris Agreement and CEO of the European Climate Foundation, and Dr. Sephora Berman, Chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Please join me in welcoming them. All right, great to be with you all. You guys hear me okay? Am I mic'd up? Good? All right. All right, let's jump into it. We all know that the stakes are really high. On one hand, climate change is getting worse. We're feeling these effects all the time. On the other hand, it feels like the markets and politics are constantly shifting. And all of this creates a really kind of challenging environment. So in this session, I hope that we can really dig into some of these bigger questions, such as, how do you lead when the ground is constantly moving? How can governments and businesses work together? A lot of times it seems that they're opposed. And what bold ideas are needed to move from where we are now to a point that we really do start to see a drop in emissions around the world? You guys are a great lineup to talk about these things. All right, my first question for you, Pak Hashim, is about Indonesia, how it really sits at a crossroads when it comes to climate of ambition and vulnerability. How do you approach these challenges that kind of mix the need for domestic development and trying to be part of longer-term climate goals?
Right. The reality is, Peter, that Indonesia is a major source or producer of fossil fuels. I mean, that's the reality. Indonesia is the second biggest producer of coal, and we are actually the largest exporter of seaborne coal. That's reality. A lot of the growth, a lot of the economy, a lot of the GDP of Indonesia comes from fossil fuels. However, Indonesia is one of the biggest victims of climate change. You know that we are an island nation, 70,000 islands. Many of those islands are disappearing because of rising sea levels. And the Indonesian government has been forced to announce an enormous public works project, infrastructure project. It's what they call, or what we call, the giant seawall, which is another name for a dike. We're building a huge dike, 800 kilometers long. It's probably going to be one of the biggest public works projects for the next 2 decades. And that is to protect the coastline of Java Island. Java Island is where more than 50% of Indonesia's population lives. A lot of the arable land is on the north coast. And that's why we have to build the seawall, because the rising sea levels, the rising seawater is actually inundating the best and most fertile arable land in Indonesia, in the whole of Indonesia. So that's the quandary we face, that's a reality. But the Indonesian government has announced a very ambitious electrification project, a program rather. We intend to build 103 gigawatts of electricity generation in the next 15 years. Most of it, 75%, will be from renewable energy. We are blessed with a lot of solar potential. We are blessed with a lot of wind potential, which is something new to me, wind potential, because there's a lot of shallow water around the water on the islands of Java, Bali, where most of the wind potential is. We also have a lot of geothermal. And now we actually have a lot of potential for biomass energy. And the next one, which is a bit more controversial, I recognize that, is nuclear. Indonesian government has decided to go nuclear. 10 gigawatts, that's the idea, the next 15 years. And then, did I mention biomass? Yeah, biomass, nature-based solutions. The Indonesian government, our president will announce tomorrow at the General Assembly, a program of 12 million hectares of reforestation of degraded forests. So we want to reforest Indonesia, and then we also want to encourage the development of the carbon markets and allowing investors to come in for offsets and the like. So that's the opportunity, that's the challenge, but also the opportunity.
Okay. Okay, and we'll follow up with a couple of those of the different things that you all are investing in. Laurence, you are the COP30 envoy for Europe. I think Europe is often seen as a leader, particularly when it comes to climate policy. But there are these constant kind of headwinds, and I think there are some right now in Europe. So I wonder if you could spend a minute talking about the situation in Europe and how what's happening in the last year, particularly, what that may mean for climate cooperation, kind of around the globe at a time when people really look to Europe for leadership.
And thank you for that question, because we are at a crucial moment for Europe. Europe has always been a leader in climate policy. We have grown since 1990 from 60% the GDP, and at the same time reduce most than 40% of emission of greenhouse gases. So the proof of the concept was there that we could grow and at the same time decarbonize, with of course an evolution in technology that came in particular acceleration after the Paris Agreement conclusion. Now what is happening? On one side there was the invasion of Ukraine. Invasion of Ukraine offered a new space for the oil and gas, fossil fuel industry to say we are representing the energy security, and we have spent more than 800 billion to compensate for the cost on the energy market. So the economic shock of the Ukraine war on the energy market has been a potential driver to say, oh, this is a lot of money, should not we finally keep to the fossil fuel sector because energy security is there. And the argument was relatively easy to make, even if a number of policies repower EU in particular, meaning putting a lot of energy. There is more than 50% now electricity coming from renewable in Europe, almost 60%. So in a way, the movement is continuing, but there is, of course, the business model for renewable energy is more difficult today. On the other side, there is a political element we should not ignore. Not only Russia is pushing for trying to demonize climate policy, portraying themselves as elite policies against people, but now you have the US administration asking every country to drop climate policy, drop net zero by 2050, to come back to the imports of fossil fuels. So the geopolitics now are pushing against climate policy, with some exception. That's why it's so good to hear from what Indonesia was doing, even China with this program of really, we may have seen now the peaking year of emission in China and maybe now going down. So there are many movements in Brazil, and all the emerging countries are thinking about a new form of development. But Europe is true, it's at risk. And the interesting thing, we are not a big part of the global emission now. Even when you look at historical elements, still not that big. But every time Europe backtracks, there is an anxiety. Why is this? Because economically it's impossible, politically it's impossible. So that's why I think it's very important to push our EU politicians, colleagues, the presidents, to stay firm and to present by COP30 an ambitious 2035 target and 2040 target, because that will give the confidence for other countries that are beginning the transition or accelerating their transition that they can do it. and they will not be economically disadvantaged to do that. And finally, Europe needs friends. And Europe, of course, the trade relations, the trade war, allow us to go from, and I know the discussion with Indonesia are going on, with India, with others, to say we need a plan, we need a trade and investment partnership to develop the transition with cooperative aspect, and not to go for extractivism, just picking the resources out of a country and then fly, but at the contrary, develop the value chain in Indonesia, for example, all the issues you have been describing, Minister. And then on the other side, find a way to construct a coalition of countries that were for peace and security and co-development, put that at the center of their discussion. So it's a crucial moment for Europe. I really hope my continent will choose the right way.
And maybe we shouldn't, just picking up on what you said, read too much into, I mean, there were lots of stories about how Europe couldn't agree on the updated nationally determined contribution ahead of Climate Week. But you've got some months.
We'll have it, I'm confident. We'll have
it'll be okay.
And it will be okay, and I hope it will be the higher range we need.
Okay, all right.
Anyway, we are just fighting for that.
Okay, all right. So this panel is about leadership in these times, and you've often urged governments to go a lot faster than they even thought, were possible. So I wonder if you could paint a picture for us of what you think leadership in these times is, what that looks like.
Thank you, Peter. I'd be delighted to. I after 29 COPs and a decade since the Paris Agreement, we're still expanding fossil fuel production and projects. So today, the Production Gap Report came out, and it shows that we're on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal between now and 2050 than we can ever burn if we want to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think there's a couple truisms here. There is no question that it's complicated, especially for countries in the global south. And that's why we need cooperation between countries, but not just on reducing emissions, also stopping expanding production. It's not a transition if we're growing the problem. And I think what we've seen in the past couple of years, the tripling of renewables, that's absolutely critical leadership. There's no question. And it is essential for countries to be strengthening their plans under the Paris Agreement, building electrification infrastructure, investing in renewables. But we can't just build the good stuff. We have to stop building the bad stuff, because the atmosphere doesn't care how many solar panels we build. The atmosphere cares how many fossil fuel projects we don't. And I think, so when we look at the question of what bold leadership looks like, it means that those in a position of power need to stop pretending they're climate leaders while supporting more drilling, more fracking, and more LNG. We have to stop expanding oil, gas, and coal, and we have to stop investing in fossil fuels. Yes, we need to invest in renewable energy and electrification, but I think real leadership looks like those who are willing to step out and join, for example, the bloc of almost 20 countries now that are cooperating in the development of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty as a companion to the Paris Agreement, because we've been working together to try and reduce emissions, but we're just allowing production to grow. And our children and our communities are gasping for breath. They're choking. Our planet is literally on fire, and millions of people are dying from lethal heat and extreme weather and fossil fuel pollution. And so I think bold leadership means standing up to bullies, and it means standing up for science. I think bold leadership right now means prioritizing public safety. It means protecting lives and living systems. And the fossil fuel industry and dangerous leaders like Trump make this seem like it's a political or an ideological issue, but it's physics. Physics are physics. And the carbon trapped in our atmosphere is smothering us. And if we drill, baby, drill, like he wants, then more people will die, quite literally. Fossil fuels are now the greatest cause of premature death on the planet. 8 million people died last year just from air pollution, primarily due to fossil fuels alone. So look, these issues are complicated, negotiations are complicated, the climate policy is complicated. But what's simple is that 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere and smothering the earth come from three things: oil, gas, and coal. And so I think right now, anyone using Trump's crusade to pollute and prop up the fossil fuel industry, when renewables are safer, they're cleaner, they're accessible at scale, and they're cheaper and available at scale, I think anyone using this moment to decrease climate ambition wasn't planning on doing much in the first place. And I think the leaders that are going to be remembered are the ones that held firm and did the hard things to save lives. Leaders like Trump are going to come and go. But we can't forget that nature bats last. And we're all increasingly vulnerable to a global hydrological and climate system that is spinning out of control right now in our lifetimes. So let's not sit here and pretend the levels of ambition that we're seeing this year so far in the NDCs or the backtracking we're seeing from the corporate sector is understandable or any way acceptable. It's not. It's dangerous, it's immoral, it's now illegal under international law, and it threatens public safety and security. So I think if this hushing that we keep hearing about is not terrifying you, then you're not paying attention.
Well, let me build on a couple. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Let me build on a couple of things that you say, and actually take this next question to you, Hashim.
Yes.
You know, we do have kind of split screens, right? You talked about in the U.S. kind of the movement towards pulling more coal and some of the things of the Trump administration helping fossil fuels really increase. But then on the flip side, there are other countries like Indonesia that is really trying to move away from coal, has some pretty bold plans to try and move away from coal by 2040, right? So Indonesia is kind of in the middle, I think, of a lot of these discussions. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about is earlier this year, after Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, you spoke some about whether Indonesia should still be part of the Paris Agreement and if it made sense. And so I wonder kind of where your thinking on that is now. I know Indonesia decided to stay part of it, right? And Indonesia is investing heavily in renewables. But I just wonder, you know, 8-9 months into this administration, after all the things we've seen, kind of where you stand on that.
Yeah, so I was actually quoted during an interview with the international publication. And the question was, how does Indonesia feel about the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement? And of course, you know, Indonesia, we have a lot of civil society, we have a lot of NGOs, and there's a lot of disgruntlement, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of unhappiness at the major power, the United States, pulling out of the major international treaty. So a lot of Indonesians are not happy, and we're saying, look, you know, we've just started developing. We started industrial development only about 50, 60 years ago, whereas countries like the United States have been doing it since the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. So there you have, you know, what people say is climate justice. Where's the justice, right? So there's a lot of pressure on Indonesia to phase out coal. I can tell you that's not real. That's not real. And one of the major problems that we have, the social problem, is unemployment. And unemployment, to create employment, we would need cheap energy to fuel our factories and so forth. And it's just impossible politically and socially to basically close down our coal, you know. So that's the dilemma we have. But we've decided to stay in the Paris Agreement. We're going to meet our obligations, and we've decided 75% of our future electricity generation will come from renewable energy. We are blessed. Indonesia is truly blessed. We have multiple sources of renewable energy, and we intend to exploit it. So that's basically, that's the paradox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's eloquent because I think a lot of countries are wrestling with that, you know, especially in the global south, especially countries that are developing. Laurence, you know, you were one of the architects of the Paris Agreement, which is like by far, I think, the most significant climate agreement in history. I don't know what things were like 100% then. I wasn't as cued in as I am now, but it really feels like today we're so fractured, right? And it seems hard to imagine the next Paris Agreement. You've worked inside and outside of government and different groups. When things are fractured like this, are there different levers that can be pulled? Are there ways to kind of pull people along?
I think so, and for all the reasons of the trade-offs you were describing, on Indonesia, for example, or I look at my colleagues in Brazil, where, of course, Brazil is the 5th exporter of oil today. You see that there is, of course, a lot of pressure on how to deliver development at the same time, just get out of polluting sources. So I think we need different levers to operate the action. I must say today, I think leaders can do so much, but they can do as much as their population will support it. Yes. That's why affordability is very important. And we see that in Europe, but we see that everywhere. How we tackle poverty directly, how climate policies are just and fair and don't, in a way, penalize the poorest size of the society, how you look at your future with the resource you have. And I have a very beautiful example, Rio Grande do Sul, a very big exporter of oil in Brazil. And you know, they have constructed a sovereign fund, and with this money, out of the oil, they want to develop the transition. And therefore, the resilience on the system, because we know that the costs are here. So my point is, today, I trust more the citizen agencies than the capacity of the government to look ahead, because their horizon is much shorter. We saw how the global finance are backtracking from any climate commitments, whether it is institutional the asset owners, but asset managers mostly, or banks. They are saying, oh, it's too dangerous. Finally, it's better to invest in oil and gas, which, as Sephora said, is not a long-term view, but at least they are earning a lot of money today. And of course, that means that every horizon of the politician are much shorter than before. So why I believe in, and really seriously, it's the agency of citizens that are concerned. And you know, all the polls at global level shows that people are concerned by the impacts. And people are concerned because governments are not delivering enough on climate policy. So what new politician needs? They need the backup. You can't have your population against you. And your population, of course, there was deep disinformation, there are manipulation. There are now, you know, in Europe, for example, you have the Russian intervention against climate policy. So number one target of the disinformation policy in Europe is around climate. And now, of course, we have the US influence to say, look, it's bad, you should abandon net zero, etc. So if politicians are not backed up by a population that demands that action, that will not happen. That's why I think it is about strengthening the civil society, but even more, asking the citizens their views, opening the discussion about the future of the kind of development they want to see. And you know, they want healthy conditions, they want a good relation with nature, they want clean air. So, but in a way, we have to build the coalition from the bottom. In Paris, it was a mix of things. We have the government, we have the local authorities, we have the civil society, we have the financial sector. Everybody came in, and we have to reconstitute that. But we can't leave the government alone. I don't think the leadership will come from there, because there are too much trade-off and pressure. But the citizen can bring the force, the agency, the energy. And that's why, in particular in these places where we are talking about many organizations, which will rally to have consultation, participation, public debates around this climate policy everywhere, and that the citizen, with their own vision, whether in Africa or Indonesia or Brazil or South Africa, they give their point of view. Because I don't think this will come from the top down. I have been in government as a prime minister office, have been, of course, an ambassador for long. You know, you feel when governments can, and they can, some can, But you see that when the forces are not there, you have to. And we are at a very low cycle of the climate policy today. The pessimism, we cannot get there, we will overshoot the 1.5. But we have to build the up cycle. See, I've been there in 30 years of discussion on climate change and biodiversity. And there is high and lows. But you have to prepare the high when you are at the low point. We have to build infrastructure now and to resist and stand up. And really, in this New York Climate Week, that's the moment we say we stand up against all that.
Interesting. I think you make a really good point that no matter what a government does, you can't have the population against you, right? They have to be part of it, and those kind of considerations actually come to the way that we think about covering stories on my team, because I think we all know historically climate change policy really moves the needle. But you can't just focus on that. You also want to reach people, on the ground level and try to tell stories along those lines. So I see some parallels there. Sephora, let me ask you. I mean, you thinking about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, thinking about kind of some of the things Laurence was saying, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels. There are 17 countries that have signed on, right, so far. Could you take us through an example or two of a country that has signed on, but is also really trying to straddle what their population wants, and kind of all these things that we've been talking about?
I couldn't agree more. We need to create the political space and the social license for countries to act. And addressing fossil fuels is hard because the fossil fuel industry has spent decades and billions of dollars fear-mongering about scarcity and affordability and price increases, and they're still doing that. And so, I think the best example of a country probably is Colombia. When President Petro took to the stage to announce his support for a fossil fuel treaty, he was very clear that every day Colombia is making the problem worse because they're the 5th largest coal exporter in the world. And he said, but we can't stop. We can't do it on our own. We need cooperation between countries. No one country is going to solve this. No one country, no one company. And so he talked about working together with other countries to develop new frameworks. And that's what we're doing under the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Trade mechanisms, tax mechanisms, debt relief, in order to support countries being able to do this and leave no one behind. And that's really difficult, especially in the global south. I mean, this morning we talked about $2 trillion in renewables. It's very exciting. 98% of that is in investment in the global north, not in the global south. So we need to figure out what those barriers are. We need capital to the good stuff coming into the global south, and we need that kind of cooperation. But to create the social license and political space, that's why with the Fossil Fuel Treaty, we started from the ground up. We didn't just go and meet with the Colombian government and say, hey, we've got this big new idea. We started working with civil society in Colombia and Latin America and Africa and South Pacific and around the world. We met with scientists, Nobel laureates. So we have now 4,000 scientists who have endorsed the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. Over 4,000 NGOs or civil society groups in 120 countries who are working on the fossil fuel treaty now and who've endorsed it. The Climate Group, thank you, has endorsed the fossil fuel treaty as a concept. And so all of these organizations starting to talk about it and socialize the idea starts to build the groundwork that is going to be necessary for a country to step out like this. We have to have that movement, and we need to support social movements, and especially the people in the impacted communities, the front lines, the indigenous people who, quite frankly, have been saying this for decades, that we need to keep more fossil fuels in the ground and reduce fossil fuel expansion. But I also want to address this question of affordability, because I think what we're doing right now in a lot of places, I think what we saw yesterday in California with the new bill that Governor Newsom signed, and what we're seeing in my own country, Canada, is that I think we're seeing leaders play right into the fossil fuel industry's message box. It's absurd. Electrification and renewable energy will free millions of people from fossil fuel bills. The idea that constraining fossil fuels is going to make energy less affordable is absurd. I mean, the sun's not going to send you a bill at the end of the month. And that's why the fossil fuel industry is fighting so hard. Because right now, they're making $2.8 billion a day in pure profit. And they've been doing that every day for the past 50 years. So there's a number of people, less than 1%, that are going to that have a vested interest in keeping the system as it is. But the system is the most inefficient energy system that could exist, because the majority of fossil fuels that we produce, we don't even use for our heating or our electricity or our transport. Less than 50%. Yeah. Because it's such, 50% of the ships moving on the planet today are just to move other fossil fuels around. Wow. So if we're going to move from a fossil fuel system to a clean energy system, we need to produce actually a lot less, and it becomes a lot more affordable. So we need that truth out, and we need to be building the right projects and showing the public that it's possible, and it's not just possible, but it's not going to reduce their quality of life or make it more expensive. It's actually going to mean that more people are not choking and have asthma and can survive. And when we talk about affordability, and this is the last point I'll make, is that we have to remember how much extreme weather is already costing us. I mean, what were the LA fires, $100 billion? And right now, extreme weather is costing us $16 million an hour on the planet. And that's every hour for the last 20 years. So that's not affordable. And that's why we need to shift as quickly as possible away from fossil fuels.
Okay. We've only got a little bit of time left, so I want to go to a bit of a speed round and just ask each of you to briefly sum up what you think is a possible outcome from COP30, if we could do that, right? It's only less than 2 months away. Thinking about 10 years after Paris, COP30, first in the Amazon. Laurence, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think it's clear what we need from COP30, because there are a lot of commitments. They will maybe be disappointing on somehow. But I think we need, after COP, a direction of travel that put all the people that want to go together. We should stop the fragmentation. We should have the platform where there is accountability on what you do, what you don't do. Oil and gas companies cannot come to the COP and pretend they do something. So we need a place where the serious people are working together, finding the solution, again, like they did in Paris, but without the one that want failure. Okay. So I would be a selective group of countries and economic actors, local authorities and civil society teaming up together, because we need a systemic reform. In many places, we need an energy system reform, but we need to operate it, not to pretend we do it. So I would say if the COP30, and they are of course very specific, I can drive, but we don't have time, but say, having people say, okay, there is now this agreement, we build on that, it is our North Star, but now we are meeting all together to implement it. And it is not, again, government only, it's all the others. And the only rule is we come if we operate, if we are serious, and if we are accountable. And that will change totally the conversation.
Okay. So I heard a lot there, but accountability and direction of travel, yeah, right, for everybody. Hashim, how about you?
Yeah, the former Prime Minister of Singapore was quoted as saying the world is now the world minus one. And the minus one is the United States. And I think what we would hope, I would hope, Indonesia would hope that there's going to be a reaffirmation for the rest of the world to continue, right? Let's hope in 4 years' time or 8 years' time, the United States will come back. In the meantime, we shouldn't lose 4 years and 8 years. So that's the hope I have, is that this reaffirmation of the principles and the goals of Paris 2015.
Okay, yeah. Redoubling commitment. Sephora, how about you? Take us home.
I agree that I think COP30 in Belém can really change the conversation, and I have been really impressed by the leadership that we're seeing from Brazil and from the COP30 presidency. The willingness to look at ethics, to shift the conversation, to recognize indigenous leadership in the Amazon. I think it's really important. I hope we'll be seeing some strengthened agreements in Belém. Coming out of Belém, I think we're going to see a lot more countries who are joining the bloc of nations endorsing and developing the fossil fuel treaty. And today, Colombia announced that it plans to host the first ever, after Belém, Colombia will host the first ever diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out next year in April. And I think that that is really important, and a number of countries, I hope in Belém, will join them in developing that conference, because diplomatic conferences on critical threats to humanity, where there were vested interests and they had those issues struggled to move within the UN system, have been critical. The Ottawa Convention for chemical weapons ban. And so I think this standalone diplomatic conference that Colombia has announced today, I'm hopeful that there'll be a bridge from Belém to that conversation, and that will really shift the conversation. And look, I think to bring us home, I would say we need to recognize at Belém and beyond that these companies are not going to manage their own decline. We need governments to cooperate to phase out fossil fuels, and that's how we ensure a stable climate. And the speed at which these companies are forced to decline will decide the fate of millions and the stability of our planet. Okay. So it's quite literally a fight for our lives. And right now, most leaders are either on the wrong side or not even in the ring. And so we have to, like we did here, not avoid these hard conversations in Belém, and then I think we'll start to see more progress.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. That's where we will leave it. A big thanks to the panelists, and for a big thanks to all of you for being here and following along. Thank you so much. Very good, very good. Very good, thank you. Thank you. Can I start it go? All right. Up next, we will be shifting gears to a climate without borders, why we must take charge to lead the world. It's the name of the next session. You'll be hearing from the Right Honourable Ed Miliband, the UK's Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, in conversation with Climate Group CEO Helen Clarkson, OBE. Please join me in welcoming them.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation with the Secretary of State. We'll talk climate critics, fractured multinationalism, and the challenge of bringing people with us. So just a few easy things that the UK's leadership's confronting. And as a UK headquartered NGO, it's really exciting for us at Climate Group to see the UK back firmly on the world stage, taking bold steps and really leading from the front. So, Secretary of State, let's dive into it. The UK has set out to become a clean energy superpower, aiming to boost renewables, create jobs and strengthen energy security. How's that ambition translating into practice, and how do you respond to critics who argue the focus on becoming a net zero economy is more rhetoric than reality?
Well, thanks, Helen. And can I just start by thanking the Climate Group for showing the leadership it has of New York Climate Week. I think bigger than ever.
Yes.
1,000 events. I'd say my most important message today is don't believe the doomsters and the gloomsters and the naysayers who say the world is somehow moving away from climate action and clean energy. It's not the case. Let me talk about the UK experience to begin with. So one of our Prime Minister Keir Starmer's 5 missions is to become a clean energy superpower. That means having a clean power system by 2030, so 95% zero carbon energy, powering our electricity system, and accelerating to net zero, exemplified by the commitment that Keir made at COP29 of an 81% reduction in our emissions by 2035, which is, I think, a world-leading target. Why are we doing it? We're doing it for all the traditional reasons. It's the right thing to do for future generations, but it's also the right thing to do for today's generations. It's about better lives today. It's about good jobs and growth. It's about energy security. It's about reducing costs. You know, Britain is still scarred by the fact that when Russia invaded Ukraine, our energy bills went through the roof because of our exposure to fossil fuels. Wholesale gas prices are still 75% higher than they were before the crisis began. So, I did this job 15 years ago under the last Labour government, and I think what's so interesting about this is that the case now is a growth case, a jobs case, a security case, and a climate case, all rolled together. And going back to what I said at the outset, I actually think that's why things are moving in our direction, because the economics has moved in the direction of clean energy, and testament to that is all the people we have gathered in this room.
Yeah. The UK's early NDC submissions being watched globally, and the world is waiting for more to be put forward. I think it's going to be a big push this week. How much pressure does being first place, put on other countries, and can it actually shape their commitments ahead of COP30?
The lesson I learn about the UK climate leadership over the last 2 decades is that under the last Labour government, when we passed the Climate Change Act in 2008, when I was Secretary of State, and we put carbon emissions reductions into law, 60 other countries then followed in one form or another. When Theresa May, the Conservative Prime Minister, put net zero into law, we now have 70 or 80% of global GDP covered by net zero. UK leadership matters, I think, and it's in our national interest.
Yeah.
Look, if there's one principle I think we should be defending, it's multilateralism. If you take the UK, we're 1% of global emissions. If we're going to have a safe future for future generations, if we're going to benefit from clean energy, we need other countries to move as well. So this isn't simply altruism. This is in our national interest. And look, 30 countries have come up with their own NDCs. Australia just came out with an important and ambitious NDC. We want others to follow. Clearly, each country faces its own compelling constraints and its own pressures. We'll have to see where we are by the time of COP30, but we want to be persuaders for ambition because we think it's in our national interest.
And you're talking there about multilateralism. There's been criticism in recent years that multilateral efforts on climate just don't move fast enough, and there's so many competing priorities. What can make that multilateral cooperation actually work? And have you got any examples that give you sort of hope for that global approach?
I mean, look, it's a good challenge. I suppose the power of example matters. Learning, I think we don't do this enough, learning from each other, what has worked in countries. I was talking to my Australian counterpart, Chris Bowen, the excellent Chris Bowen, yesterday. He talked about his election campaign, where the combination of solar panels and batteries was an election-winning offer, which persuaded people towards climate action. I think the thing I would say about the COP process, and I was at Copenhagen, I mean, I'm not sure I should admit it, but which didn't go so well for those who weren't around at the time, in 2009. But look, the COP process is an imperfect process, but it is the best process we've got. And the reason it's the best process we've got is that we are talking about 190 plus countries, and we are engaged in this incredibly complex process of countries changing the way they power their economies, changing the way industry gets its power, changing agriculture, changing households to meet this enormous challenge and take advantage of the opportunity. So no wonder the process is complex, and I'm sure there's ways in which COPs could be better, but I think, I would say, as well as don't believe the doomsters, I would say don't give up on multilateralism.
Yeah.
Because only by countries, I was at a forests event this morning, and in Glasgow, my predecessor set a target of $1.7 billion of finance for forest communities, for indigenous communities and local people. We've exceeded the target, $1.86 billion. Is there further to go? Yes, there is. But it shows multilateralism can work. And if we don't have multilateralism, I think it is that way lies disaster for the world. And so I think the whole process of engaging in the COP and keeping that process going, and obviously under the very good Brazilian presidency, is incredibly important, however difficult, however complex it is.
Yeah. So to misquote Voltaire, if COP didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
Yeah, or to sort of slightly paraphrase Churchill, it's the worst system we've got, but it's better than any other system.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like that's the reality.
Yeah. We often hear about this silent majority, the 89% who want climate action, but they're not the loudest voices in the debate. So how do we bring people with us on this journey, and what role is there for politicians and business leaders in turning that real public support into momentum?
Look, I think the key and most important thing is that we this collective, are in the better lives business. So important this. We're not in the hair shirt business, we're in the better lives business. We're in the business of, I'll just give you an example. It's an area of Britain where we've got a new carbon capture and storage plant, a net zero Teesside, getting thousands of jobs to local people. And community by community, place by place, showing people the benefits you get. Solar panels on rooftops, making heat pumps cheaper so that people can afford them and people can cut their bills. Warmer homes, clean air, all of those things. We're not just in the disaster avoidance business. I sometimes say Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare, he said, I have a dream. And us being in the avoidance of nightmares business is obviously important, but we're also in the business of showing people how their lives can be better today. And I'm not just sort of saying that because I think it is a way for us to be popular and to persuade people. I think it's true. I think it's the reality. Nick Stern, the famous British economist, always says this, which is, green growth is the biggest economic opportunity of the 21st century. And all of the business people in this room and all of the business people gathered at New York Climate Week who are doing amazing things. And when I meet you and I hear about what you're doing, I feel incredibly inspired. You're showing that. You're showing that in what you do. And of course, there are going to be people who want to sort of, throw rocks and throw obstacles in the way, but they're not going to win. When you look at the trend rather than the cycle, when I was climate change secretary last time, we were heading for a 4 or 5 degree world. Okay, now we're heading for something like a 2.6 degree world. That's bad, and we've got to avoid that, and we've got to get the numbers down. But the world has made progress, and we do need to narrate that, and we do need to affirm that, because I think there's a danger that people think, well, you've been talking about this problem for 30 years. Have you actually made a difference? The answer is a resounding yes.
Great. For the Americans maybe don't know, prior to your current role as Secretary of State, you had a side hustle as a podcaster with a reason.
Now everyone does. There's probably everyone in there. Put your hand up if you do have a podcast. Yeah, okay, they're a bit embarrassed. They're a little bit embarrassed about it.
And yours was called Reasons.
You'll shortly have a podcast if you don't have one already. That's the general sort of trend.
And so it was called Reasons to be Cheerful. Great podcast. Can you leave us with one quick reason to be cheerful?
It's very nice. Helen didn't mention the fact that I was also leader of the Labour Party beforehand and lost the general election. That is extremely diplomatic of you. Look, I think that the main reason to be cheerful is the extraordinary coalition which we see at New York Climate Week and what it exemplifies. Business people, civil society, academics, policymakers, governments, NGOs, and what that coalition is achieving and the way the world has moved. Last year, we saw something like $2 trillion of investment in clean energy. That's double the amount in fossil fuels. The clean energy economy across the world now has 35 million people working in it against 33 million in fossil fuels. So the trend is in our direction. Of course, there are challenges. And of course, the sweep of history is not linear or easy. And of course, when you make big change, including big social and economic change, there are people who want to stop it happening. Let's just be honest about this. No big social and economic change has ever happened with a warm, cuddly, cozy consensus where everybody sort of sings Kumbaya, plays the guitar, and is very happy. There are always people who are going to, for various reasons, entrenched vested interests who want to stop this happening. But I believe we can have real confidence. And I think that this coalition that we see, this business, civil society, trade union, government coalition, and what countries are doing all around the world gives us hope and gives us real reasons to be cheerful.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, please join me in thanking the Secretary of State.
Thank you very much.
For your time.
Thank you so much.
That's great.
For our closing flagship panel, please welcome the Chair of the UK Board of Climate Group, Mike Rand, Emmanuel Normand, Vice President for Sustainable Development at Saint-Gobain, Anna Claudia Rochbach, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Habitat, and Dr. James Fletcher, Climate Envoy for the Caribbean Community, CARICOM.
Good start. Ladies and gentlemen, delighted that you're here for this session. I know our distinguished guests have already been introduced, but just to refresh, Emmanuel is the Vice President of Sustainability based in Paris for Saint-Gobain. Anna Claudia, who's originally from Brazil but now based in Nairobi, is Executive Director and also Under-Secretary General for Habitat for the United Nations. James Fletcher is here. James is also he's the Climate Envoy for CARICOM. So we've got three very distinguished people who hopefully we can draw out this afternoon about the impact of climate change on real people in real places. And it's been really interesting this morning so far. I thought we would start out with a few questions to our distinguished panel about how no one is safe, no matter where they are in the world these days. We're all on the front line of the climate crisis, one way or another. And the impacts of climate change are being felt most acutely at the local level, in homes, businesses and communities. And it's here that resilience really matters. So I thought I would kick off with a question to Anna Claudia. Today we're sort of unpacking how we can keep climate action people-centred. Often we talk over people. People say we're either evangelists or we talk in scientific terms. But how can we keep climate action people-centred and help communities stay resilient to the shocks of escalating climate? So we'll be wanting to explore what's needed from policy, from government, in terms of finance, and also business action to make sure that the action on the ground actually protects lives, livelihoods, and places. So, Anna Claudia, you've spent years working with cities worldwide where climate shocks aren't abstract. They're not something that's way off in the future, as bad as it might be. They're right at people's doorstep and right now. What lessons from those communities and the experiences that you've seen do you think the rest of the world should be paying closer attention to 25 years away from reaching net zero?
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, indeed, I think there is one important angle, between climate change and urbanization that we have to really understand, right? And this angle is people who is suffering most, basically the ones who are living in the most vulnerable territories. And it's not a coincidence that we are facing a global housing crisis, and we have many people living in conditions that are not the adequate ones, talking about 3 billion, more or less, right? And a large number of people also living in extreme vulnerable situations. Talking about informal settlements, we have 1 billion, more than 1 billion, living in informal settlements. So these are areas that are not typically recognized by the cities. They're outside of the urban plans that haven't been receiving, the amount of investments needed to improve resilience and to improve infrastructure and, at the end of the day, quality of life. So I think we have to look at urbanization and see the different features of urbanization right now, recognizing the most vulnerable territories, and then looking at the future. So what's happening now? Today we have about 50% of the population of the world living in cities. In 2050, we're going to have about 70% of the population of the world living in cities. The major part of this growth is going to happen in Africa and Southeast Asia. And we're talking about 2 billion people. If we look at Africa, for example, in average, half of the population living in cities, they live in informal settlements. So we're talking about cities that are going to receive about 1 billion in the future and are already facing major infrastructure gaps. So for me, the big challenge and lesson number one is to really understand these territories, embed these territories in the planning processes, and put priority there, and engaging with communities. The practices that we have out there are several in terms of addressing heat, flooding, and everything else, but the processes and the prioritization is what will make the difference.
Are there any particular areas where you've seen outstanding action that's really impressed you that could be an exemplar for other areas?
Well, I do think many cities were able to map and recognize these vulnerable communities, embed them into the urban plans, and work on transformation, working with the communities. Here, governance, and when I speak about process, I speak about participation, and I speak about governance. So having the ability of working with communities, and here the local action is critical for climate change. So first the urban lens, and then secondly the local action, because mayors, local authorities, they have much more capacity or ability to talk with communities. And communities, they know the solutions. They know the context just much better. So we can apply our know-how, our expertise, nature-based solutions, sponge cities, make the cities greener, improve and expand, the parks and public spaces. We can do that all, but we should do that with the communities because they understand what are the opportunities, they know the context, and they are able to match with more resources.
Thank you, James. CARICOM has faced hurricanes after hurricanes, from Hurricane Maria to Irma to Dorian, hitting capital cities and towns that are also the economic lifeblood of member states. From your perspective, what are the biggest gaps in resilience, and what needs to change now to better protect people and their livelihoods?
Thank you. In the Caribbean, resilience is not an abstract concept. It's something that we have to deal with every single day. And very often people focus on the major extreme events, so the hurricanes. So Tropical Storm Erica goes through Dominica in 2015 and causes damage equivalent to 90% of that country's GDP. And whilst that country is trying to recover from Tropical Storm Erica, a storm that devastated the entire community to the point where the government had to move people out. So you talk about climate migration, that's already happening within countries. 2 years later, Hurricane Maria passes and destroys Dominica completely to the extent of 226% of that country's GDP is destroyed. So a country goes from being relatively prosperous, although recovering from a tropical storm, to the following day seeing over 2 years of economic output wiped out. That same year, Hurricane Irma goes through the British Virgin Islands and causes damage of 300% of GDP. So I think it's difficult for someone who does not live in the Caribbean to understand the impact that a hurricane has on the Caribbean. You've heard of some of the really devastating storms in the United States of America. You know, you've heard of Katrina and what that did to Louisiana. You've heard of what the storm that hit the eastern seaboard of the United States. But the rest of the U.S. survives. Whatever catastrophic has happened in New Orleans, the rest of the U.S. survives. The rest of the U.S. goes on business as usual. When a hurricane goes through the Caribbean, the entire country is decimated. Every single element of the operations of that country, governance, social services, everything is completely decimated. And that happens on a regular basis. So almost every island is in a regular cycle of repair and recovery. And as I said, it's not just the hurricanes, it's the droughts that devastate agriculture. So farmers have to be abandoning their vegetable plots and moving on to something else. It's the flooding that takes place sometimes out of season that causes massive damage. And some of these countries are criticized for having high debt to GDP ratios. But when we drill down, we recognize that a lot of that debt is because they've had to be constantly borrowing money to recover from hurricanes. So the very easy, simple answer to that question is finance. Finance is required because for all of the islands, they know what resilience looks like. They know what they have to do to become more resilient. They know what they have to do to deal with flooding events that used to be 1 in 100-year flooding events, but now 1 in 10-year flooding events. So hurricanes that move like Hurricane Otis did from being a tropical storm to a Cat 5 hurricane in the space of 12 hours. So imagine you're preparing for a tropical storm, and then when it hits your island, as it did in Acapulco, when it hits that part of Mexico, it's now a Category 5 hurricane. That's what we have to be dealing with. So it's finance to allow us to develop that level of resilience. Finance to be able to build up our infrastructure so that that infrastructure is able to withstand, as best you can withstand a Category 5 hurricane, withstand and recover. We talk about bouncing back, but we say, no, not bouncing back. We want to bounce forward. Because if you're constantly bouncing back, it means that 3 years later, you're at the same point where you were 3 years ago. So we need that type of support that will allow us to continuously move forward, which we're not getting. And an insurance mechanism that I think is a lot more sympathetic because, as you pointed out, the Caribbean is based on 2 major drivers of its economy, agriculture and tourism, particularly tourism. There are very few investors that will want to come to invest in the Caribbean if every year you have storms decimating infrastructure, tourism infrastructure in the Caribbean. So for us, it's finance that is at a scale that we can access, not at the scale that we have right now, where you have $300 billion allocated for, well, supposedly allocated for adaptation, but the UNEP gap report has shown that what is required is more like $400 billion every year. Or loss and damage, where we have $750 million pledged, but what has been identified as being the ask is more like $400 billion annually. Those are the types of gaps we're looking at. And then the difficulty in asking small island developing states that have limited capacity to run through hoops to access that money, so that by the time they access the money, the problem that they're trying to deal with has magnified 3-fold and 4-fold. So it's finance, and it's access to finance, and the scale of that finance. I think those are the big issues for us.
Thank you, James. I guess we've touched on, of course, infrastructure, and that brings me to Emmanuel. Saint-Gobain shapes the spaces where people live and work. You're a huge organisation internationally. When you're thinking about resilience, how do you design solutions that work for such different needs across incredibly varying regions? I mean, I think often getting intelligent investment in design is half the way, apart from finance. How do you do that?
Okay, thanks, Mike. Let me just give a few words about Saint-Gobain. Saint-Gobain is a 50 billion euro company. We are celebrating this year our 360th anniversary. We operate in more than 70 countries, 170,000 people. We have a purpose that is making the world a better home. And actually, not only for resilience, but generally speaking, when you are talking about building and construction, those markets are by essence very local. Construction habits are very different from place to place. It's why Saint-Gobain has decided already since a number of years to adopt a multi-local organization. In all the countries where we operate, a country CEO, and in most of the cases it's a native from the country, is overseeing all the businesses of Saint-Gobain that they are serving building and construction. And he has the responsibility really to understand what are the needs, in depth, working closely with the customers, with all the stakeholders to identify what are the relevant developments related to the needs of the countries. And for example, we have now 5 major research centers located in France, located in US, located in Brazil, located in India, located in China, really to address the different needs, the different geographies, the different climates all across the globe, and being able, relying on the group resources. Nevertheless, we are a big corporation, so we have best practices. We have solutions that are being developed elsewhere, not to reinvent the wheel, but to use that strength to understand what needs to be done locally.
Okay, that's interesting. Anna Claudia, getting money to flow, and that's been raised, to flow where it's needed for resilience and climate action in cities is never simple. I've been involved in FAO and World Food Programme and other organisations. Often there's too many players, there's too many completely different timelines, there's bureaucracy. So in your experience, what's actually worked to get resources moving quickly to the places most in need?
Well, there are several factors, right? I mentioned the urbanization and the local action before. Just this year at the UN conference, Finance for Development in Seville, we discussed, and it was recognized on the outcome document, the relevance of subnational finance, right? The other aspect is how can we have more resources to fund urban infrastructure? And my take is that, of course, there is the international resources are there, and we have to tap into those, and there's still a room to amplify or to increase the international finance available towards urban. But there's an expertise related to that, right? So, for example, parts of these resources, they flow through the IFIs. This means that the IFIs, they need to expand their urban portfolio. So this is one challenge. The other aspect is that we lack capacity for projects, and also projects that leads to systemic change. So even if we are able to tap into these resources and amplify, part of the challenge relays on the capacity to elaborate these projects around the world, especially if we talk about climate action. The good news, I believe, is that what we also observed in this conference, and I've been observing throughout our work, UN Habitat, is that more and more governments, but also cities, they are progressing in terms of leveraging domestic finance, because this is where actually systemic change can be founded, right? If we have the long perspective. So we see today cities that have been able to improve their revenues based on land, right? We see governments like, for example, Kenya, where I am based, they have leveraged domestic resources to fund housing, right? So, and then Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, all their large-scale informal settlements, urban, they are funded domestically, right? So these are the good news. So we are finding ways to localize the finance, let's say so, because in terms of promoting change. But I would say that the major challenge is not the finance itself. I would slightly disagree with you. But it's more, and I agree with Professor Mariana Mazzucato, she has been promoting this thesis, is the what and the how. Yeah. Because we need to agree on the priorities, and I mentioned before the most vulnerable, right, as a priority. We have to agree on the priorities, and we have to go with that as a society throughout several years. And we have to create the capacities, from the procurement to project design and so on, so that cities, so that governments and communities are able to leverage the finance.
Which brings me back to James, and for many CARICOM states the biggest hurdle isn't knowing what needs to be done because you've been struck repeatedly, the same thing repeating and repeating. It's getting the money back to flow fast enough to build, to really build resilience. From your perspective, what is actually working best to unlock finance and get it to the communities that need it most?
I think blended finance is one that we've seen work very well. So a combination of public finance to de-risk projects, particularly projects in the renewable energy sector. We've seen it work in Dominica, for example, very well, that embarked on a very ambitious geothermal project, and it was able to do that with public finance to de-risk a lot of the early work, the geotechnical work. So I think where you see a combination of public finance and private finance. We have to be, although, a little careful here, because we've always said that the funding for adaptation and loss and damage should not be primarily private finance, because it's a little unconscionable to ask a country or a group of countries like the Caribbean that have contributed historically and continue to 0.2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, that they now have to borrow money from the same countries that have caused the problem to create the resilience that they need to deal with the problem. I don't think that's the equivalent of you breaking my knees with a baseball bat and saying to me, I need to borrow money from you for the surgery, for the cast, and for the crutches that I need to get better again. So we've always said that the private finance for things where we can reduce the cost of energy, which is a no-brainer, 40 US cents per kilowatt hour from imported fossil fuels, to bring that down to maybe 20 cents using renewable energy, we can borrow money to do that because there's a return on that investment. We can't borrow money, and we should not be asked to borrow money to put in sea defenses and to improve the resilience of our infrastructure for a problem that we did not cause. So blended finance, I think, is one that has worked. We've seen with insurance, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which has worked very well. It's a parametric insurance, and it pays out to countries once there's a hurricane and you've established what the damage is. You don't have to go in and do individual assessments. The problem with CRIF, though, as we call it, the acronym, is that it's a little limited in its scope. So maybe more financing, again, coming through the Loss and Damage Fund for responding to loss and damage, so it can increase the range of its impact. So things like wave action that will damage the boats of fishers. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, found that she couldn't get that covered on the CRIF because it didn't extend that far. So I think using facilities that are already there, and also helping to build resilience at the national, at the community level is so important. With community-based solutions, things like strengthening ecosystems, because our ecosystems are really what will provide us with that buffer, be they coral reefs or mangroves or forests. So support that gets directly to the communities. And sometimes the financial support gets a little bit too concentrated and stuck at the government level and does not go down to the bottom. So how we get that money to flow so that the communities that need to build the resilience can actually do the resilience and do it themselves, I think is some of the things that we can look at.
I think that's a really good point, because the same with the Pacific Islands, which I'm a bit closer to. I mean, natural solutions as well as kind of built resilience are part of the equation. And I think that's a very good point, Emmanuel. Resilient buildings often don't show their value on a balance sheet until a disaster occurs. So how do you approach making the case for investing in sustainable, resilient construction sort of today, which might cost more?
It's clearly a difficulty, even though we start in many places to see a kind of green premium. If I take an example here in the US based on a survey done by the US Green Building Council, 11% of higher office rent for LEED building compared to non-LEED buildings. 25% higher sales price for LEED building compared to non-LEED building. And sustainable buildings are resilient buildings. We are also, Saint-Gobain, we are performing a yearly barometer, interviewing thousands of stakeholders in more than 20 countries to understand their perception of sustainability in construction. And what you mentioned is clearly highlighted as being a difficulty. And actually, we will convey this week here in New York a workshop in the frame of what we call our Sustainable Construction Talk to address this issue in particular. But what I can see as being more recent development is the question of the insurability of the buildings. That's particularly here the case in the US, where you have many places where, because of risk of flooding, because of risk of fire, more recently in California, buildings cannot be insured anymore, or can only be insured if there are specific technical solutions that are being used. For example, against hail, we have developed roofing shingles that are resistant against hail, and it's starting to become mandatory from insurance company to provide the insurance, or fireproof materials in California.
Same is happening in Australia and Queensland. People either can't afford to insure their homes because of either bushfires or floods, and sometimes those floods have come every year, or basically the insurance companies won't insure them. So I think this is an increasing crisis that's building every year. We've got a final round of questions because I've just been told to please wrap up. So just very quickly, a final message, rather than the questions that I've been given, from each of you about where we should be heading. So Anna Claudia?
My point is we have the solutions there. I mean,
Yeah.
the technology, the expertise, the know-how is out there. We have plenty, many projects that have proven to be sustainable and to improve resilience in some neighborhoods and cities and so on. But we have to go at the root causes and structural issues. So how we plan our cities, recognizing that the land has not only an economic function, but also a social and ecological function. And we are here in a very compact city, but urban sprawl is there, and is making our cities, prone and more vulnerable. Looking at what you just said, the sustainability. So this triangle, sustainability, accessibility, and affordability, still requires a lot of research. So we need to improve, the body of research and understand the structural issues and go for that. It's only systemic change that will help us to, consolidate and maximize the solutions that we already have out there.
James, final message from you.
So in addition to everything I've said about finance, I think there are a few things that we have to do ourselves. So we have to mainstream adaptation into all sectors. We have to look at how do we cause every single one of our sectors to become more resilient. The health sector, tourism, education, infrastructure, agriculture, water, they're all impacted by climate change. So it has to be a very far-reaching adaptation strategy to build resilience into all these sectors, particularly at the ecosystem level, because healthy ecosystems will give us the kind of resilience that we need to be able to withstand the impacts of climate change that are worsening. Secondly, we have to ensure that we engage with youth and civil society. I think too often the response, particularly in small island developing states, interestingly and very curiously, has been a government-led response. We need to engage with civil society and with young people so that they can be at the center of whatever we're doing, because we're doing it for them, and we can't do it for them if we're not doing it with them. And my final point is we need to pay attention to something that's different this year that was not the case last year. There have been three very important rulings, legal rulings, one by the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, one by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and recently the International Court of Justice. And all three of these rulings, particularly the last one, have said that NDCs, nationally determined contributions, what countries do to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases, it's no longer just a moral responsibility, it is a legal responsibility. Countries have a legal responsibility to use the best available science to ensure that their actions on climate are aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And I think that's extremely important because we now, in addition to the work that has taken place at the scientific level, we now have a legal arm to fall on. And the same way, and I've been saying this for a while now, and I'm happy that it's coming to fruition, the same way in 1998 you had the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement that changed the whole way in which the tobacco industry operated and stopped denying the science that cigarette smoking was causing cancer. We now have the basis for jurisprudence that will allow us to call these huge emitters to task, take them to task and make them do what they are supposed to do. So I think you will find how we use those rulings and how we build a jurisprudence that will allow particularly civil society to get a lot more engaged is going to be extremely important moving forward.
Emmanuel, just briefly, final wrap from you.
Final wrap, I want to retake the title of this session, putting people at the center of action. I mean, I agree with you, we have all the technical solutions. But if we're not able to answer to the needs of the people, we will not be able to bring sustainability and resilience at scale.
A brilliant finish. I would like everyone to thank our panel this afternoon. Very interesting. Thank you.
Very good. Excellent.
We'll now take a short 30-minute break. Refreshments are available in the networking lounge, and we'll reconvene in the thematic rooms for the next set of sessions at 3:30 p.m. sharp. Thank you.